yourself.
The movie Casino came out in 1995. It became a practical overnight sensation and intrigued the audience with its characters. Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci portrayed the main characters, and despite their names being altered in the film, they were based on very real people. Frank Lefty Rosenthal and Tony Spilotro had many shady dealings in Vegas, and almost all of the scenes from the movie, including the one where Tony squeezes a guy's head in a vice, are all true, and we will talk about many of them today. The fate of Spilotro is especially interesting since, unlike Rosenthal, who tried to do business quietly, Tony became an uncontrollable psychopath and gangster in Vegas and was ultimately hunted by the entire state police force. His unbridled temper led to terrible and irreversible consequences for the Chicago Mafia. But Spilotro wasn't always like that. Very soon, you will find out how a simple boy from an Italian immigrant family becomes a vicious and ferocious gangster, and what happens to those who lose control and stop listening to their bosses. At the very end of the video, we will tell you an interesting fact about one of the 6 Spilotro brothers who didn't become bandit and how their destinies ironically crossed at the end of their path. When talking about Spilotro's childhood, the scene that immediately comes to mind is one from the brilliant Scorsese film Goodfellas. The main character of the movie, Henry Hill, lives across the street from a popular gangster joint, and from early childhood watches them and wants to become just like them. Tony Spilotro was born 5 years before Henry Hill on May 19, 1938, in Chicago. He also lived beside bandits, and from early childhood was head over heels for the local gangsters. He didn't want to become a doctor, a cop, or anyone else for that matter. He wanted to be a mobster. But that's where the similarities between Tony and Henry Hill pretty much end. Compared to Henry, who had Italian heritage only on his mother's side, Tony had every reason to join the Mafia and become a major player, perhaps even a boss, since both Spilotro's mother and father were true Italians who immigrated to America in 1914. There were a whopping 6 kids in the Spilotro family, and surprisingly, all of them were boys. The family wasn't poor either. They owned a profitable diner called Patsy's Restaurant, and everything would have been well if not for the fact that the diner became a haven for criminals. The Spilotro kids grew up in a perfect environment to become future mafiosos. They were born in the most criminal city in America, where the memory of Al Capone was still fresh in everyone's mind. They were Italians through and through, and they grew up beside the Mafia. It's doubtful that the parents wanted such a future for their kids, but they constantly watched, listened, and were surrounded by bandits who filled the family restaurant in ever-increasing numbers. It even got to the point that thugs began to hold many of their meetings right in the parking lot near the restaurant. Naturally, Tony and his brothers absorbed the criminal world around them, and after a while, 5 out of 6 brothers connected their lives with crime. Tony Spilotro and his brothers began engaging in petty crimes together, including shoplifting and wallet theft. Tony became a notorious district hooligan with a reputation as an avid scrapper. In 1954, when the boy was only 16, tragedy struck the family. The father suddenly died. It was the father who had at least some leverage over his boys, but with the death, the brothers threw off all of the shackles and completely plunged into a life of criminality. The family needed money, and crime, which Tony enjoyed, wasn't a bad way to get a decent amount of cash. After the death of his father, Spilotro quickly defined the direction of his future life. While in his second year at Steinmetz High School, he instantly dropped out, and while engaging in petty crime, was caught trying to steal a shirt from a store. Some sources claim that Tony wasn't trying to steal a shirt, but rather a watch. Whatever his intentions, he was charged with theft, fined $10, and placed on probation. This didn't stop Spilotro, and instead had the opposite effect. By the time he was 21, Tony had been arrested a whopping 13 times, but petty crime in no way helped the young buck join the ranks of the Mafia, which he desperately desired. Spilotro decided to be more subtle, and in 1960 he married a good-looking waitress, Nancy Stewart, who worked in a local mob hangout. By 1962, he befriended several influential members of the Chicago criminal underworld, including the future mob boss Joseph Aiuppa. Among all the other noteworthy acquaintances, Samuel "Mad Sam" DeStefano stood out. He immediately liked the promising, short, and lively boy and decided to invite him into his crew. DeStefano became a big game ticket for Spilotro, but unfortunately he was a terrible mentor and a bad role model. The relationship with such a character played a detrimental role in the already cruel nature of young Tony. DeStefano was considered too unpredictable and undisciplined to be considered a true leader, but his cruel and sadistic personality was highly regarded by his bosses to spread fear and terror. One of the cops who was on the mob's payroll said he was a real sicko. He would do things to disrespect you, like coming into a bar and pissing on the floor in front of your wife. Mad Sam openly bribed the police, lent money at exorbitant rates, and gladly killed those who didn't pay up. For such occasions, he even had a soundproof torture chamber in the basement, which he was very fond of using. He gave some of his debtors a gold watch with his name, so that in the event of a murder, the police wouldn't think of him, since by giving his victims watches, he allegedly created the impression that he was on good terms with the victim and simply had no reason to kill them. One day, while driving, DeStefano saw a man and forced him into his car at gunpoint, drove him to his house, and forced the poor fellow to have sex with his own wife, all because of some real or imagined resentment that DeStefano had for his wife. And this is just a small part of all the horrendous acts that were committed by Mad Sam. Many in the FBI still consider him to be the most violent torture murderer in the history of the United States. However, the mob bosses tolerated DeStefano as he made them big money. DeStefano took Spilotro under his wing and prepared the young man for the next big venture in his criminal career, murder. Tony desperately wanted to join the ranks of the Mafia, and murder was a sure way of moving up the criminal ladder. Almost immediately after joining Mad Sam's crew, the chance presented itself. The mob had a problem with two small-time thugs, Billy McCarthy and Jimmy Mariah, who killed several local businessmen in a drunken argument. Killing legit business people in a neighborhood of mobsters was a no-no, especially as it brought attention to the Mafia. Tony's group was tasked with finding those responsible and taking care of it. It seems that when the mobsters finally found one of the predators, they used the same basement for interrogation, in which DeStefano was very fond of torturing his victims. When Spilotro tortured Billy into giving the names of the others involved in the murder, Billy's tough Irish nature kept him going strong until his head was in a vise. The poor Irishman could no longer endure such torment and ended up spilling the name of his comrade. Spilotro was furious and lost all control. He started spinning the vise, squeezing it harder and harder until one of Billy McCarthy's eyes popped out of its socket. It was unbelievably cruel, but it was real. The scene is perhaps one of the most memorable in the movie Casino. After killing McCarthy, Spilotro and his accomplices quickly found the second perpetrator, who was in for the same fate. 2 weeks later, both bodies were found in the trunk of Billy McCarthy's car. The vicious killings won Spilotro a reputation with area mobsters and earned him the status of Maid in 1963. Tony finally received the thing he had dreamed about since he was a kid, and yet he was still far from a high post in the Chicago Mafia. He wanted much greater power. He needed to continue bringing in money and prestige for his bosses, and Tony willingly complied, especially now that he was officially under their protection. It didn't take long for Spilotro to kill once again. In November 1963, DeStefano had a violent argument with Leo Foreman, a real estate agent and one of DeStefano's juice loan collectors in Foreman's office. DeStefano was physically ejected by Foreman from his office and then went into hiding. Later, DeStefano's underlings Tony Spilotro and Chuck Grimaldi contacted Foreman and said DeStefano wanted to let bygones be bygones. Dragging Foreman into the basement, Spilotro hit him in the genitals, then attacked him with an ice pick before finishing him off with a shot to the head. Just like the previous victim, Foreman couldn't handle this much torture and began to be killed quickly. When everything was concluded, Tony, as usual, left the body in the trunk of a car. The murder was once again tainted with inhuman cruelty. The victim had pieces of his body cut out while he was still alive. But that wasn't the end of it. Spilotro was also responsible for the death of William Action Jackson. Jackson was hung up on a meat hook and tortured. Under Samuel "Mad Sam" DeStefano's leadership, Tony became incredibly violent. He became a true sadist with simply uncontrollable aggression. The Mafia bosses weren't too fond of this transformation. Spilotro used to be simply violent, but he wasn't as crazy. They decided to cool his temper and for a time get him out of Chicago. Spilotro was sent to Miami in 1964 to protect and oversee the profits from casinos in the area, primarily controlled by sports bettor Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal on behalf of the Chicago outfit. For those of you who have seen Casino, there is no need to once again introduce the character played by Robert De Niro. Truthfully, however, judging by Nicholas Pileggi's book, Rosenthal was a much less pleasant person in life than he was portrayed in the movie. Rosenthal's nickname came from the fact that he was left-handed. Some romantically claim he got the nickname when, in 1961, he appeared before the Senate hearing on organized crime and invoked the Fifth Amendment 37 times, keeping his left hand in the air while doing so. By 1961, Rosenthal had gained the reputation of a professional gambler and one of the best sports betting and gambling experts in the United States. He was an associate of the Chicago mob but couldn't join its ranks, as he didn't have Italian heritage. He struck up a friendly relationship with Tony Spilotro, who was a true Italian. Despite knowing each other for a long time, it was in Miami that they truly became close. This was aided by the orders from the mob bosses who told Tony to look after Lefty Rosenthal, as he was raking in a sizable profit. They had to separate for several years once again in 1967, when Spilotro was once again recalled to Chicago. The southern climate and the distance from the cruel and uncontrollable DeStefano helped Tony, and he calmed down a little. He wasn't brought back to Chicago to go back to his old ways. The FBI has been tracking Anthony Spilotro for a long time. He was nicknamed Tony the Ant by the media after FBI Special Agent William Romer referred to Spilotro as that little pissant. Since the media couldn't use pissant, they shortened it to Ant. Leaving for Miami slightly cooled the interest of the legal authorities in Tony, but as soon as he returned, they began to take him seriously once again. Even before Spilotro left, the FBI managed to turn Charles "Chucky" Grimaldi into a federal witness. This was the same Grimaldi who participated in the murder of Leo Foreman, the man who offended Mad Sam DeStefano and pushed him out of the door. Despite overwhelming evidence, both Spilotro and DeStefano would later be exonerated. In 1967, in a crackdown on illegal gambling, the IRS agents raided Spilotro's home and learned he'd been running a gambling operation out of his house. He was fined but served no time. In 1969, the police department's vice suspected Spilotro was running a bookmaking racket in an abandoned basement and set out to raid it. Spilotro and his associates stalled the police at the door while they ate the paper bets in an attempt to destroy the evidence. But he was busted when more evidence was found in his office. Once more, he was fined but didn't serve any time. The FBI was on his heels, and working in Chicago became unbearably difficult. It became necessary to immediately change the scene. Otherwise, sooner or later, Tony would have gone to jail. As a result, with the help of the Chicago outfit bosses, a solution was found. Spilotro had to go to Las Vegas and conquer it. Here, away from the bosses, he could run wild. The outfit's Tony "Joe Batters" Accardo put Spilotro in charge of its Las Vegas interests in 1971, replacing Marshal Caifano, another soldier with a brutal history who was rumored to favor the blowtorch as an educational tool, but whose effectiveness may have been limited due to his entry into Nevada's Black Book of those excluded from entering casinos. The early 1970s were a heady time for mobsters, when the mob controlled virtually every casino worth controlling in Las Vegas, and the skim diverted millions into the coffers of the outfit and to other mobsters. The outfit placed Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal in charge of the Stardust, with frontman Alan Glick and Spilotro in charge of keeping Rosenthal happy and skim operational. Tony once again united with his old friend. Despite Vegas being territorially closer to LA, the local gangsters who were humiliatingly referred to as the Mickey Mouse Mafia couldn't do anything to oppose the more powerful crime families. It didn't take that long for Tony to catch on to the fact that Las Vegas was an unplowed field and he could do whatever he wanted. Spilotro, under the pseudonym of Tony Stewart, took over the souvenir shop of the Circus Hotel, which he sold a few years later for a huge sum. He also started a loan shark business with Frank Vapensiero, the head of a Los Angeles-based crime family. All local gangsters had to pay Spilotro a street tax if they wanted to continue running their criminal business. If someone refused, he would no longer be working. The desert was a big place, perfect for hiding the bodies of anyone who rebelled. Everything was going well for Tony and his team, but trouble came out of nowhere in 1972 when the Chicago police once again started digging under Spilotro. He was charged with murder. The main problem was that along with Spilotro, his longtime sadistic mentor Samuel Mad Sam DeStefano was also indicted. By this point, the psycho bandit was even more whack. It was dangerous to be in a courtroom with such a person. Nobody knew what to expect from him. He could say or do something that was beyond the bounds of decency. Previously, DeStefano had a bad habit of clowning around during trials. He could easily come to one of the hearings dressed in pajamas. Once, he even entered the courtroom in a wheelchair, citing his poor health. While serving a perjury sentence at Statesville Penitentiary in 1968, Sam DeStefano was able to have himself transferred to Augustana Hospital, supposedly for an urgent surgery. No surgery was performed, but DeStefano had several parties in his hospital room and conducted his shylocking business through a hospital telephone. Regardless, both DeStefano and Spilotro got lucky. The case was squashed, but the instability, suspicion, and uncontrollability of Mad Sam increasingly worried Chicago bosses. They understood that it was impossible to say with certainty what he would do, and if caught once again, who knows what could have happened. Ultimately, murder was the sole solution that ensured everything remained in working order. If you stepped outside the bounds, you got beat up. Those were the rules. To ensure nothing detrimental would come from Mad Sam, they decided to remove him, entrusting the task to his previous ward, Tony Spilotro. For Tony, this was a solid chance to boldly put his name once again on the lips of the bosses and climb a step higher in the mob. To assist him with this undertaking, he was assigned DeStefano's younger brother Mario as help. Early in April of 1973, Sam DeStefano received a warning. While he and his wife were out, someone entered their Galewood home, apparently using some sort of passkey at the kitchen door. The intruder disabled the security system and robbed the home of a mink coat, a mink stole, and a .30 caliber revolver. The minks were each valued at over $800. Police were called to investigate, but could find no clue as to the thief's identity. Mad Sam didn't use this opportunity to change his address. On the morning of April 14, 1973, his remains were found in his garage. The younger DeStefano, Tony Spilotro, and Mad Sam were supposed to meet in the garage to sort things out. Before the meeting took place, Tony entered the lot and shot DeStefano twice with a 12-gauge shotgun, hitting him in the chest and severing his left arm at the elbow. Mad Sam died instantly. The neighbors told the police that they didn't see anything. The authorities believed that the murder had been planned for months. The killer was never brought to justice. After the successful operation, Spilotro didn't receive any promotion and returned to Las Vegas. Things, meanwhile, were going flawlessly in Vegas. The feds estimate that Spilotro's men successfully siphoned off hundreds of thousands of dollars from casino profits. Thanks to his ability to evade law enforcement agencies and successfully conduct business, Tony very quickly became a colossus in the criminal world. While Frank Lefty Rosenthal was busy working at the casino and going through numerous scandals with his wife Jerry McGee, Tony decided to double down on his favorite activity, stealing. He formed a group of thieves that included true pros of the profession. The crew became known in the media as the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang because of its penchant for gaining entry to homes and buildings by drilling through the exterior walls and ceilings of the locations they burglarized. Spilotro didn't forget about killing people either. In 1974, according to the Los Angeles Times, there were more gangland-style killings in Las Vegas than in the previous 25 years combined. In the same year, Spilotro was indicted for theft from the Teamsters Union's Central States Pension Fund, but Spilotro beat those charges as well when the principal witness was murdered, also by shotgun blast. It didn't take long for Tony to bring his younger brother to Vegas. He wasn't a member of the Mafia, but he desperately wanted to become one, and joint business with his brother could have greatly aided him in this regard. In 1976, they opened a jewelry and electronics store, Gold Rush, which sold both stolen and legitimate goods. Spilotro had to be careful when it came to what was sold in the store. He avoided selling items that were stolen in Las Vegas, lest the rightful owner came into the store and saw them. He also correctly suspected that the FBI had the store bugged, so he needed to be careful when speaking on the phone. Gold Rush, located 1 block off the Vegas Strip, became home to Spilotro's team of burglars who would break into hotel rooms, wealthy homes, and high-end stores and steal their goods. But that still wasn't enough. Authorities told the press that in the spring of 1977, Spilotro had partnered with Paul Shiro in the Phoenix, Arizona region and was competing there with the underworld interests of New York's Bonanno clan. Spilotro, it was claimed, was funneling drugs from Mexico into the Chicago area through his Arizona territory. Federal agents valued the drug traffic at $8 million per year. The more power Tony amassed, the more he forgot about respect and the fact that he was still only a soldier in the Chicago outfit, despite being the top dog in Vegas. Perhaps he was tired of waiting for a promotion. Maybe he was fed up with the police, who was constantly on his heels. Or perhaps he simply stopped giving a damn about everything and everyone. But the reality was that Spilotro began running his mouth more and more frequently, often scolding and ridiculing his bosses in public. He was especially outraged by the fact that these rats were only capable of receiving parcels of money that he, Anthony, earned with his sweat and blood in Vegas. Spilotro also became distant with his friends and underlings, often looking down on them and not forgetting to scold them given the opportunity. Naturally, the loyalty of his crew suffered, and his bosses, hearing the rumors coming from Vegas, were also getting disgruntled with his antics. And yet, while Tony kept successfully covering Rosenthal and sending a solid chunk of his profits back to Chicago, the bosses didn't take any concrete steps against Spilotro, although his growing disorderliness began to bother them. Tony was heading in the exact opposite direction, and the arrest of one of his partners, Jimmy the Weasel Fradiano, only made things worse when Fradiano became a government witness. Fradiano was the main suspect in one of the murders, and the cops quickly picked him up. The situation was dire. Jimmy the Weasel knew too much and could have used that knowledge to send many people behind bars. Spilotro had his own people in the police force and learned that Fradiano was willing to testify against some of his former associates in exchange for $10,000. So Spilotro informed Fradiano that he would immediately give him the $10,000, as well as all the money he could ever want if Fradiano kept quiet. But this was a trap. As soon as the Cleveland Mafia boss found out that Jimmy the Weasel was in the hands of the authorities, he immediately ordered him killed. So regardless of if Fradiano worked with the feds or not, his destiny was sealed. It didn't take long for Fradiano to find out that there was a hit order on his head, and to save his life, became a government witness against the Mafia. Having testified extensively against the mobsters he worked with, Fradiano did not forget to mention Tony Spilotro. By the end of 1978, Fradiano was supplying evidence to federal agents and prosecutors, and Spilotro's involvement in Las Vegas casinos was clear. The Nevada Gaming Commission added Anthony Spilotro to its Black Book in December of 1978. In Casino, Joe Pesci said that there were only 2 names on that list, and one of them was still Al Capone. In reality, the list had quite a few more names. The route into casinos was now closed for Spilotro, which significantly complicated the main task for which the Chicago bosses sent him to Las Vegas: protection and assistance for Frank Lefty Rosenthal. The following summer, investigators began to pick apart the company that managed Stardust in Fremont. That company was ostensibly run by Alan R. Glick, but the government discovered that Glick was fronting Spilotro and the Chicago outfit. Spilotro's partnership in a nationwide gambling racket based in Ohio was also discovered, as was his cooperation on gambling ventures with representatives of the Kansas City, Milwaukee, and St. Louis crime families. Nevertheless, not without difficulty, Spilotro was still free, even if he could no longer maneuver as freely as before. Huge credit for Spilotro's freedom had to be given to his lawyer, Oscar Goodman, who was a real ace in his field. Interestingly, from 1999 to 2011, Goodman would become the mayor of Las Vegas. Who else but him could have the intimate knowledge of what actually happens inside the city? The situation was somewhat reminiscent of the one that occurred in Chicago some time ago. Spilotro caused quite a stir in Vegas, to the point that he was hounded by pretty much every law enforcement agency. He was the main criminal of the city. The Internal Revenue Service was involved in the investigations by early December of 1980. Narcotics agents joined the pile-on early in 1983. Las Vegas agents tried to catch Spilotro in a narcotics sting operation, but the savvy gangster refused to step into the trap. Regardless, he was once again caught not long after. On the night of July 4, 1981, the Hole in the Wall gang was planning yet another large shop robbery, which by their estimates would net a tidy $1 million in profit. As soon as the bandits got on the roof, however, the police surrounded the store and arrested almost everyone involved. They were each charged with burglary, conspiracy to commit burglary, attempted grand larceny, and possession of burglary tools. Spilotro was nowhere to be found, but 2 weeks later he was tracked down and arrested. The robbery was botched due to the flight of the alarm specialist Sal Romano. He became an informant after the authorities accused him of another crime and thus tipped off the police about the planned robbery, setting up the entire team. The cops hit the jackpot. Not only did they arrest the whole gang, but also converted some of its members into their witnesses. Frank Collada became one of such informants. He gave heaps of evidence against Spilotro. However, Collada's testimony proved to have insufficient hard evidence, and prosecutors were unable to link Spilotro to the crimes. Tony the Ant once again miraculously escaped justice. His lawyer was once again on top of things. Believing in his own invulnerability, Tony became completely unhinged and began to get cozy with Frank Rosenthal's wife. Jerry McGee, played by Sharon Stone, was as gorgeous and bright in real life as was portrayed in the movie. She married Rosenthal in 1969 and bore him 2 children. Just like in the film, the girl was absolutely unbearable, loved to provoke scandals, be in everyone's sight, and could not imagine life without wealth. She was around 44 years old when she started an affair with Tony Spilotro. Despite them trying to hide the affair, it was in vain, as Spilotro was being followed absolutely everywhere. Even though McGee divorced Frank Lefty Rosenthal in 1981 and was now effectively a free woman, Rosenthal was not thrilled about her having sex with his friend, especially considering that their affair began before the divorce. Lefty's and Spilotro's friendship was completely ruined. One day in 1982, when Rosenthal sat down and started his Cadillac, the car exploded. An explosive device was installed under the car. The bomb exploded, but luckily Rosenthal escaped death and just burned his leg. Not unreasonably, many suspected Tony Spilotro to be behind the assassination attempt. After all, he had a clear motive. Obviously, something this large couldn't have gone down without the Chicago bosses finding out. Spilotro, already on thin ice, was now on the verge of being eliminated. Tony once again showed how uncontrollable he had become. He made mistake after mistake. Under no circumstances should he have contacted Rosenthal's wife, who, by the way, ended her life as stupidly as she spent it. She was found under the influence of drugs in the lobby of the Beverly Sunset Hotel and died 3 days later. Some believe that she was killed by the Mafia, as she knew too much, and a few weeks before her death, there was an attempt on the life of her ex-husband, Frank Rosenthal. Las Vegas was a mess. Everything was going to hell in a handbasket, but the worst was yet to come. In the middle of October of 1983, federal investigators had all the information they required. Spilotro and 14 other racketeers from Chicago, Milwaukee, and Kansas City crime families were indicted in connection with a multi-million-dollar casino skimming conspiracy. A quote attributed to Anthony Spilotro at the time was, "The United States of America versus Anthony Spilotro. Now what kind of odds are those?" The indictments virtually shut off the flow of Vegas gambling dollars into the Chicago, Milwaukee, and Kansas City families. That tremendous loss of income was widely blamed on the mistakes of Anthony Spilotro. His ambition had led to notoriety. His suspicion and hostility had caused productive mafiosi to become damaging government witnesses. Despite once again winning in court and escaping punishment, the Mafia had had enough. Once upon a time, Spilotro ruled Vegas with efficiency, but in recent years he began to attract too much attention, which was harmful for the business. His younger brother Michael also added fuel to the fire. In the early 1980s, he began using the same strong-arm tactics as his brother, taking over rival bookmakers. He owned a restaurant called Hoagie's, which was a popular outlaw gathering spot. The windows of the restaurant were almost always darkened, and none of the locals dared go inside. Michael seemed to believe that his brother's name was all the protection he needed, and therefore did what he wanted without fear of being punished. People who worked with him started to hate him, but oddly enough, that feeling was not shared by the Chicago bosses. Unexpectedly, they decided to promote him and make him a full member of the family. His brother Tony had to be present for such a festive event. On June 14, 1986, the Spilotro brothers headed toward Chicago in anticipation of the long-awaited ceremony. Arriving at the designated place, they were met by numerous acquaintances and friends. As soon as the bandits entered the house and went downstairs, Tony realized that something was wrong. It was a trap. Turns out that they were summoned here not to celebrate Michael's promotion, but instead to be executed. Tony asked to pray before he died, but neither he nor his brother were granted the privilege. They were immediately beaten and kicked, and then strangled. 8 days later, their bodies were found stripped down to their underpants in a cornfield in Enos, Indiana. The freshly dug soil was noticed by a farmer who thought a poacher had buried the remains of an out-of-season deer and reported it to the authorities. They were identified through dental records provided by their brother Patrick Spilotro, who was a dentist. He was the only brother of the Spilotro family who didn't go on to become a criminal. Even though his life wasn't as wild as Michael's or Tony's, he was still alive, and nobody wanted to kill him. Informant Frank Collada, who began cooperating after his longtime friend Anthony Spilotro began plotting against his life, told authorities that Michael's activities were to blame for the two deaths. Michael had stepped on too many toes and had to be eliminated. Outfit bosses decided that Anthony could not be left alive to avenge his brother. In 2007, Nicholas Calabrese, who was directly involved in the murders, were able to clear up most of the mysteries surrounding the Spilotro murders. According to Calabrese, Anthony Spilotro had to pay the price for the loss of income in Vegas and for members of his team who cooperated with the law. Tony brought an incredible amount of unnecessary attention upon himself, which was bad for business. Due to this, the Mafia began to lose a lot of money, and when too much pressure from the authorities came down upon him, the bosses ordered him killed, since it was easier to get rid of him than to try and once again hide or help Tony get out of trouble. Spilotro did this to himself. The only hitch in the Chicago outfit's plan was that the bodies were found only after 8 days. John Ficarrata, the man responsible for such a colossal screw-up, was also soon killed. After the death of Spilotro, serious consequences followed, which gradually led to the decline of the Mafia. The number of indictments against Chicago mobsters was greater than at any time in their history. With Nicholas Calabrese's help, the FBI arrested 11 men in April of 2005, charging them with involvement in 18 murders, including those of Spilotro's. The feds who listened to Tony Spilotro's wiretaps expressed that he was one of the smartest men they had ever encountered in organized crime. Perhaps one day he could have even become a boss, but the traits of a psychopath, which he acquired not in the least through his collaboration with the sadist Sam DeStefano, caution, which Spilotro was never famous for, and the inner conviction that he could get away with anything did not allow him to rise above the status of soldier. In Las Vegas, he felt himself a god and went completely mad. At the age of 48, he died the same way he lived. This guy was a criminal and made many people suffer mind-boggling, painful deaths. In his final hours, seeing his brother killed before his eyes, Spilotro suffered like them.